On and on like that for hours, every answer rephrased into another question, as if they didn't understand a word he said. Not even so much as a "must have been rough." Nothing. Not even a handshake at the beginning. He told them the truth. To every question, he told them the truth. They'd listened to the tapes. They knew what Doug had seen on his screen and what he'd failed to report. Yet they never asked him what information he'd communicated to Vrieger, as if they knew in advance the story they wanted to tell. Back home, apparently, the Joint Chiefs had already begun covering for what had happened. The engagement occurred in international waters. Untrue. The Vincennes was acting in protection of a flagged tanker. Untrue. As the kids steered to avoid the potholes, the jeep swung gently from side to side, while a song by Journey played on the radio. Doug had listened to the same song in the backseat of a friend's car in the parking lot of a mall in Alden, Massachusetts, the week before he'd left home to join the Navy. Hearing it now, that big stadium rock anthem with the soaring guitar and hard, wounded voice of the singer, angry at the love lost and the damage done, he pictured his mother alone in the apartment, and for a moment he imagined what a relief it would be if the jeep were to swing too far into the opposite lane, where it might meet a truck with no headlights, seeing in his mind's eye the explosion that would consume them, a blast as instantaneous as a ship's missile striking a plane. But this was weakness. He would not be weak. 3 years had passed since he'd left Alden without saying a word to his mother about where he was going. And though in the last 24 hours since the incident he'd been tempted to call her, that would mean having to account for himself when all he wanted to do was tell someone the story, someone who hadn't been there. Yesterday had been like any other morning. Coffee and cereal in the wardroom, and then a walk along the aft deck before the temperature rose above 100 degrees and the railings became too hot to touch. Looking out over the stern, he'd seen the milky bellies of jellyfish flip by the ship's wake to face the sun, floating atop the surf along with the garbage tossed from the sides of tankers. On the passage out, across the Pacific, he'd written the last of his college applications, as well as the letters to the banks and brokerages where he'd hoped to get a job while he studied, behind the counter or in the mailroom if that's all they had to offer him. Most of the guys he knew leaving the service were going for jobs with defense contractors, electrical engineering and the like, but he'd known all along he wanted more than that. Down in the gloom of the combat center, his shift had started quietly. Nothing on his or Sikorsky's monitors, but an Iranian P-3 doing surveillance down the coast, and some commercial air flights out of Bandar Abbas, puddle jumping to Doha or Dubai. Since June, the Vincennes had been detailed to Operation Earnest Will, escorting Kuwaiti tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. Kuwait was Saddam's biggest ally in his war against Iran, and the U.S. Fifth Fleet had been tasked with protecting her ships from Iranian gunboats. America was officially neutral in the Iran-Iraq War, but everyone knew who the enemy was. The Ayatollahs, the ones who'd taken the hostages back in '79, who'd bombed the Marine barracks in Beirut. Their gunboats weren't regular Navy, but Revolutionary Guard. Basically, a bunch of loyalists in speedboats loaded up with mortars and small arms. A helicopter pilot told Doug he'd seen 4 guys prostrate on the deck of an idling Boston whaler, their heads bowed west to Mecca, RPGs leaning up against the rails like fishing poles. As the duty officer in charge that morning, Vrieger took the call from the frigate Montgomery. 5 or 6 gunboats had been spotted out of the tiny island of Abu Musa, headed towards a German tanker. When Vrieger called the captain, a man eager for his admiral's stripes and the combat he'd need to get them, he immediately ordered general quarters. Boots began stomping above and below, hatches slamming closed, the ladder steps rattling as men poured into the combat center to take their stations. 80,000 horsepower started churning so loudly it sounded as if the rear of the ship were detaching. They were doing 30 knots before the skipper got down from his cabin, the command net in Doug's ear already starting to fill with chatter, the signal weakening as half the ship began listening in on the Sony Walkmans they'd figured out could be tuned to follow the action. And then as quickly as it had arisen, the incident seemed to dissolve. Ocean Lord, the helicopter the captain had